Welcome to Our Voices. In his most famous civil rights speech, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said he'd been to the mountaintop. But have people of African heritage really made it to the summit in America? This week, we look at the story of Africans in America, from slavery to segregation to the civil rights movement, and today's Africans who have come to this country with hopes of building a better life. Hello there, I'm Haiti Adams Fitzpatrick.
And I am Hadiza Kiari.
Hi, I'm Ayen Bior.
And I'm Orion Itangishaka. What does it mean to be Black in America? And are those experiences shaped by the legacy of activists like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? Here's a look at Black experience in America, both for African Americans and African immigrants.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up.
August 29, 1963, it was a speech that galvanized a nation and put civil rights and economic justice at the forefront of the American conversation. Race, media, and communication professor from American University, Sherry Williams.
What he was really trying to do was achieve racial equality, and not just racial equality, but also economic justice. We know that right before he died, he was working on the Poor People's Campaign.
Howard University's Greg Carr says while there has been some progress, economic disparities still exist.
The median wealth of Black households, for every dollar that a white household has, a Black household in this country has about 10 cents. That's absurd.
But the currently relatively strong U.S. economy has boosted the job market for all races. The unemployment rate for Blacks fell below 6% last year, the lowest since 1972. Still, according to a recent Harvard University study, half of all Black Americans report experiencing discrimination in the workplace. Giannis Bouchard is a software engineer working in Silicon Valley. He says as an African immigrant, he faces the same kind of discrimination as Black Americans.
It's happened in small ways where, you go to a meeting with an investor and you can tell that they just don't want to hear what you have to say, and sometimes you can kind of feel that it's just because of you and like your color, and they're not even open to it.
Police brutality in predominantly African American communities is another source of concern. The Black Lives Matter movement that surfaced in 2014 after the shooting in the state of Missouri of a Black man by a white police officer has taken up the cause.
They open our eyes to everything. They help us understand that while we may not be seen as human or powerful currently, that the fruits of our labor will soon come.
Being Black in America has certainly changed since the famous Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech. America twice voted for an African American president in 2008 and again in 2012. But improving race relations, as evidenced by a recent resurgence of white supremacy groups, have quite a ways to go. Deirdre Murray McIntosh for Mariama Diallo, VOA News.
So, watching this makes me realize that the Civil Rights Act, which ended segregation and banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, sex, or religion, only passed in 1964. That was only 55 years ago. It's really not a long time at all. So there are people alive today who know what it's like to live in a segregated society. And I think that the racist legacy of slavery and segregation still haunts us today. The institution of slavery built the economic foundation of America. And yet today, descendants of slaves are still marching for racial and economic equality.
Well, I think the civil rights movement built the foundation for people like us who are immigrants from Africa to enjoy and really be the beneficiaries of the civil rights that they fought for back then.
Right.
But I think there is still this stereotype in some circles that Africans who come here to sponge off the land. I mean, there is the stereotype about immigrants in general that we still hear, when in reality that's not the case.
Cannot be further from the truth.
Africans come here for the large part, and for the most part, they're educated, they're entrepreneurial, and I mean, this is not a cheap ticket.
No, it's not.
Really is. It's not a cheap visa anyway. So I think people who come here are self-reliant, as we've experienced ourselves, because we have to be.
That's right.
You know, you don't get here otherwise.
That's
not
right.
from Africa, maybe from Europe, but not from Africa.
That's right. And I think that, like you said, civil rights movement did definitely pave the way for us as African immigrants who came here. I mean, I was born on a continent, spent most of my childhood there, but I came here and went through the education system. But what I realized was that the children were not being taught the truth and the realities about Africa for them to actually maybe even understand the experience. And I mean, this is the way, not their fault. It's a way not their fault, because the education system and the parents themselves are the ones that have the responsibility to teach those children. I mean, all they know is what they see on TV. But, you know, when you come to the U.S., you find yourself having to define, to identify who you are and actually introduce yourself to society. You have to actually show that you are actually a member of society who can contribute to the society.
It's not just what America can do for you, but you have to prove what you can do for America.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Definitely. It's been proven by research that Africans actually who come here excel. I mean, actually, I'll read you the Migration Policy Institute's quote. It says, sub-Saharan African immigrants have much higher education attainment compared to overall foreign and native-born population. In fact, compared to the total foreign-born population, sub-Saharan Africans are more likely to be employed in management, business, science, and arts and occupation. So for Martin Luther King, who asked whether we have reached the mountaintop, I think for African people of African descent have proved in America that they have arrived the mountaintop. When they're given opportunities, they excel and they actually go above and beyond. They're actually
and you know, I have a slightly different experience. So I came here as an adult, and I remember in graduate school back then, one of my classmates, African-American classmate, had asked me, where you from? And I go, I'm from Nigeria. And he was like, oh, I thought you're from Africa. So, I mean, that didn't even end there. He went further to ask me, how many years did it take you to get here? You can imagine how flabbergasted I was. But it made me realize how little they knew about Africa and our history. But then I also remember reading something about the late Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General. So back in the day when he was still in school, he was visiting the South, and this was right around the time where we had the civil rights movement, right? So he wanted to get his hair cut, and he goes to this white barber, and the white barber says to him, well, I don't cut the hair over the N-word. And he replies, well, I'm not the N-word, I'm African. But he did get his hair cut. Well, I mean, the thing is, you know, there were a lot of questions regarding why would Kofi Annan let, you know, a racist cut his hair?
Well, either way, Kofi Annan was brave enough to allow a racist white man with a razor that close to his neck.
Exactly. During those years.
But you know, is the disconnect there because the histories are different? It is a different trajectory of your life if you are African American and if you are African in America. Is that perhaps where the disconnect is?
Yes, there's definitely a disconnect. And I'll tell you, like, for an African, they come in here with the dream of that American dream, you know. So they would tend to naturally stay away from protests against police brutality, things like Black Lives Matter, because at the back of their head, they're thinking, I don't want to get in trouble, immigration, deportation.
Oh, especially if they're not a citizen.
Right, right. So, I mean, the thing is, if an African-American makes a mistake, he's only going to go to jail. As an African, you know, most likely going to be deported. I don't want to offend a country that's given me the opportunity to live that American dream. So you don't want to compromise that. At the same time, you know, we've seen most of African countries have dealt with colonization and imperialism. So it is difficult for them to really understand what it is like to, you know, having one's entire culture and language and traditions wiped out completely.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, because, I mean, I think a lot of time is just not understanding each other's struggle. I mean, a lot of times we just don't know each other's struggle enough to embrace them. But I think for the African experience, who come here willingly, they come here by their own means, a lot of times we come in with hope. We come in with faith that we're going to excel. And so a lot of times we don't have the traumas that our brothers and sisters that came from the continent through slavery that have gone through years after years, centuries after centuries. So we come in with hope, and we have this, you know, light at the end of the tunnel that we can actually believe in and we can actually achieve it. So, you know.
Well, I'm the descendant of slaves, and I come from one of the few places in Africa where slaves were brought to and not taken from, that is Cape Town. And, you know, for us, we have a similar social conditions today in our neighborhoods that you see in many black neighborhoods here in America, poor black neighborhoods, let me point that out. Because we come from slaves, we sort of share that similar feeling of, you know, search for your identity, that feeling of dispossession. I can understand that because over generations, like you said, your culture has been stripped away. Your identity is deliberately being taken from you systematically. The systematic oppression, that leads to some of the same problems that we see in Cape Town, South Africa, that we see here in many parts in the United States, with gangsterism, with alcoholism, just the systemic poverty. And so I can understand that experience of feeling you can't go anywhere for a better life. This is home. There's nowhere else you can go. And you see the suffering of generations of your people, and you must question, who am I in all of this? What is my place in all of this?
Well, ladies,
escape route.
Ladies, there's a lot more to this conversation, and we want to connect with you on social media. Catch us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our handle is @VOA Our Voices. We've got videos and updates. Be sure to share our pages with your friends.
Also, don't forget to use the hashtag VOA Our Voices.
We're also on WhatsApp, so send us your messages and your videos. Our number is US country code +1 304 506 3638. So reach out to us and add your voice to this discussion.
And my favorite part about the show is actually the selfie videos. Well, let's go ahead and hear what some of you have to say.
So we have a clamoring of leaders that are trying to work their way into a public space, but not really because they want to provide transformational leadership there. So what I really think is that it's probably likely to be something that is pushed from outside of the public space, maybe by the private space, maybe by the civil space, where we have that new type of leadership. And it actually demonstrates what the difference can be. I think that's really, in my mind, how it's going to happen.
You see, as citizens, we are not valued. And I feel even the economy is kind of spoiled, for outsiders are more here than ourselves, Kenyan, and they have more value than us. That's why we go out to look for a better future.
Well, we're going to take a break now, and when we come back, we take you on a very special road trip as young South Africans experience history in the American South. Back in a moment.
Like Voice of America on Facebook. Follow VOA on Twitter. Join VOA on our YouTube channel. Like, follow, join VOA.
You're with Our Voices. Welcome back. Ask anyone who has had to stand up for their civil rights, and they'll tell you it's not easy, and it almost always comes at a cost. The lessons from Black Americans' struggle for social and racial justice are still relevant and in places beyond the borders of this country. So watch what happened when I joined fellow South Africans visiting the American South to experience the pivotal moments of the civil rights movement. We're in the U.S. state of Alabama. This is home to some of the most important people and places of the civil rights movement. 18 young women from South Africa and America are about to go on the road trip of a lifetime and relive the moments of tragedy and triumph that redefined this nation. We meet the brave girls on their first stop, Montgomery. On the street, chatty excitement. But inside the Civil Rights Memorial Center, the mood changes. Seeing the martyrs and heroes of the civil rights movement. The realities of racism and the power of activism come alive on these walls. For Audrey February, born and raised in the townships of Cape Town, this is an eye-opener.
The people that fought for freedom was very brave, and they touched me because many things like that happened here, happened in South Africa as well. I got this perspective of America, that life in America is just so great and nothing bad happens here.
Human rights lawyers at the Equality Justice Initiative explain America's difficult path from racial violence to reconciliation. Here, more than 300 jars of soil collected from sites where Black Americans died from lynchings. At the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, monuments to those victims. A powerful tribute to African Americans hanged in hate and the lives of millions swallowed by slavery. Next stop, Selma, a town whose name is forever etched in American history. We're here on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, about to retrace the steps of one of the most important moments of the civil rights movement, the historic 1965 march from Selma to Montgomery. This bridge was the scene of the Bloody Sunday beatings, civil rights activists marching for the right to vote, confronted with deadly violence by local police. The attacks sparked outrage and public support for the passage of the Voting Rights Act. The girls traced the footsteps of brave men and women who dared break through racial barriers.
In South Africa, I think we can relate because apartheid only ended in 1994, and we have a long way to come, and people expect change to be immediate. But if you look at Selma, it's been decades, and they're still trying to create the society that they wish for.
Before it became a beacon of the civil rights movement, Selma was a city of African slaves. Here, the girls are lined up to experience the humiliation of slavery.
From this point on, you would not make eye contact with me. If I catch you looking at me, I would get rid of the person to your right. Nigga, don't roll your eyes no more at me. Drop them. Drop your eyes now.
Ainka Jackson runs the Selma Center for Nonviolence. She takes us on a drive through the city's impoverished neighborhoods. In some ways, this place seems like a memorial of its own to the lasting legacy of racial and economic inequality.
There's such a spirit of hopelessness here in Selma because at one point there was great hope that voting rights would cause us to have economic prosperity. But I believe that part of the reason why Dr. King was killed so that we wouldn't get there.
Not every moment on this journey is somber. One highlight, soul food and song with today's civil rights activists. An emotional tribute to Africans who came to America in captivity and those who fought for the freedom of future generations.
I think what we can learn from each other now is that the work is not over. There's still work here to do in America, and there's still work to do in South Africa, and that with reconciliation there must be justice.
And I'll tell you, that was quite an experience. And, you know, it's really made me realize and appreciate how well African Americans have captured that narrative of Africans in the United States over generations and over centuries. And I think the way they do that with museums and all these monuments that you see, especially in places like Selma and Montgomery, Alabama, it was just such a powerful and humble tribute to not just the heroes, but their stories. I think that narrative is told in such a way that is really accessible, not just to people of different generations, but also to people of different countries and different cultures. I think they did a great job.
The museums have done a great job, but I hope that that success trickles down into the schools. I actually was surprised to learn that the Southern Poverty Law Center found that only 8% of U.S. high school seniors know that slavery was a central cause of the Civil War, and only 22% of high school seniors know the role that the Constitution played to aid slave owners. You guys know that I'm from Texas.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, this year the Texas Board of Education decided that students will learn that slavery was was the central cause of the war. In 2019, they finally decided that.
Wow.
And you know, it is really incredible. And if you realize that 1 in 10 students, 1 in 10 public high school students are in Texas, so there's a large portion of the population that doesn't know the true history of slavery and the consequences of slavery.
Yeah, I wonder I hope that, you know, other states will do the same. I mean, I wish that Africa will do a better job of preserving its history just as much as the African American did.
Right.
You know, one country that actually did that, I'll have to single out Ghana. Ghana has done a great job of doing that. We know the door of no return is simply one of the most spectacular and talked about places to visit in Africa. However, it's not to take away from other countries like Nigeria and Gambia and Senegal. You know, you have the Badagry Heritage Museum in Lagos. You have the Kunta Kinte Island in Gambia. And then you have the House of Slaves in Senegal. So, you know, they need to do more.
Yeah, definitely to preserve museums is really, really key. And also education, Ayen, what you mentioned about education, I think education is very key. What our children know or don't know is our responsibility and the responsibility of the education system. I mean, many places in Africa, you see, because of war, museums aren't respected. They're actually targeted.
And destroyed.
You know, and destroyed,
sometimes
to try to wipe out the history of the previous leaders. And, you know, for me, I had a great experience of here in the U.S. to go into a HBCU, a historically black college. And for me, those kind of institutions stand as monuments. They stand as museums, actually, because here in America, it's the only place that I realize that it's the only place where you can get Pan-African perspective on African history. And African Americans have a privilege to send their children at a place where they can actually be taught the true African history. So it's when I really begin to appreciate my Africanness, you know.
Africanness.
My Africanness, you know. I grew my dreadlocks and I felt really African at an institution here in America. You know, so identity for you young women is being molded by your perception of your history, you know. If it's a positive one, embrace it. Once you realize it, if it's a negative one, don't conform to it. You know, rise above it and do something different to help yourself and to help others around you. More importantly, educate yourself about who you are and your history. You will learn to appreciate yourself.
Where were you when I was at school?
Yeah, where were you when I was growing up?
Right. And, you know, I had to learn about my African heritage. And of course, because I'm mixed race, there's a lot to learn. I'm total mutt. But I learned about this only when I decided at university to study African politics. And that is what opened my eyes. At school, at primary school and at high school especially, all I got was how my peoples were oppressed, how they were conquered, how they were mistreated and violated. And I will tell you, that doesn't do much for one's sense of self, for your self-esteem, your sense of place in your country and the place that your story and your ancestors have in your country. So even today, if my son's growing up in this country, I am very careful about what they're learning about civil rights, the civil rights movement in this country,
and who they're learning it from,
who they're learning it from, and what's in their textbooks. That is so important. And I really wish that when we learn about slavery in this country, that the story doesn't start in America, because the story doesn't start there. The story of slavery in America starts in Africa.
That's right.
And I think if we start at that point, maybe people will learn more about the continent. But coming back to what's in our textbooks, I think that is very important. It really affected what I learned, and I'm very careful about what my children read about Africa and about their experience here, because what we learn, the narratives we learn there, that goes straight to the culture war.
And speaking about the narratives, I'm really proud of the work of the film industry. Movies like 12 Years a Slave, Ava DuVernay's Selma are really inspiring.
Really, I mean, I remember watching Roots as a kid.
Me too.
And you did?
In Africa, yes.
Yeah. So, you know, for the most part, that's where most of my memory of African history, African American history came from.
That's true.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember seeing any African-produced movies based on slavery.
From the African perspective.
Yes,
that's so true, but you are Nigerian, so you should talk to Nollywood about that.
Stop making soap operas, yes.
It's time now for a break. Our Women to Watch segment is coming up next, so stay with us.
Every day, African women on the continent and the diaspora are doing extraordinary things. And we want to highlight their contributions in a segment we are calling Women to Watch.
I first met Nyadol Nguyen on Twitter, where she regularly challenges racism and discrimination against African Australians. She's a lawyer and an activist whose writings shed light on the everyday issues and challenges she and many others of African descent have to undergo. Her contributions to the fight against racism have earned her the Racism It Stops With Me award, given by Australia's National Anti-Racism Strategy. She is fearless in the face of hate and intolerance and bold when it comes to exposing racist ideas. She's often the target of racist comments online, but she doesn't let that slow her down.
My woman to watch is Opal Tometi. She's a Nigerian-American human rights activist, writer, and a community organizer. As a co-founder of Black Lives Matter, she used social media to bring worldwide attention to the racial inequities faced by Black people. Currently, she's the executive director at the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. Through a series of successful campaigns, she's gained global recognition for the advancement of human rights, migrant rights, and racial justice worldwide.
Allow me to break the rules because I'm watching a man, Kizito Mihigo. He's a Rwandan singer and genocide survivor and peace and reconciliation activist. Kizito became very popular after singing a song about the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. In his lyrics, he stated, "All the deaths are the same, whether brought by genocide, war, sickness, or other causes." He also said, "Genocide made me an orphan, but that shouldn't make me forget others who hurt from atrocity that were not called genocide. They are brethren and human beings too." Soon after that song was released, it was banned in Rwanda. Several weeks later, in 2015, Kizito was arrested on conspiracies against the Rwandan government and was sentenced for 10 years in prison. 4 years later, he received presidential pardon in September 2018. Kizito says he will continue the work he started as a kid, promoting unity, peace, reconciliation, tolerance, and forgiveness among Rwandans in his music. That's a man to watch.
Well, now here's someone who'll make you feel like you've done nothing with your life.
Really?
She's a young South African who, at the age of 13, became a symbol of the fight against what she saw as her school's racist hair policy. Zuleika Patel made headlines in 2016 when she protested against the dress code at the prestigious Pretoria Girls High School that required Patel and other girls of color to tame their natural hair. Well, Patel is anything but tame. She led a protest that not only ended that hair policy, but inspired similar protests at schools across the country. That protest also led to an inquiry into other allegations of racism at the school. What have you done lately, ladies?
I love this. I love Patel.
She is a woman to watch.
She's definitely, I agree. Use the hashtag VOA Our Voices and tell us who you think is a woman to watch in Africa. It would be great to learn about the women you see changing society.
Be sure to watch Our Voices on the VOA website where you can find the world's top stories.
We leave you with a quote from the First Lady of Civil Rights, Coretta Scott King, widow of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who used her voice to say, "I am convinced that the women of the world, united without any regard for national or racial dimensions, can become a most powerful force for international peace and brotherhood."
We hope you enjoyed this fascinating conversation with us. Thank you so very much for watching. From all of us here at The Voice of America, until next time, goodbye.